cover their volumes as well. So in a sense, this presentation basically serves as a comprehensive guide through the intricacies of challenges that are there in India's FMCG industry right now and why volumes aren't growing. The question, hey FMCG, where's my volume growth? The report, the author with us in the studio, Abheek Singhi of BCG with us. Abheek, thank you so much for joining us. The question, I mean, FMCG volume growth has just not come about. Do you see any potential for turnaround in the very near future?
No, thank you, Mangalam. And, I think you've done a fantastic job of summarizing. The premise was, is this a short-term phenomena or is this a long-term phenomena? And as you mentioned, this seems to be a long-term phenomena. I think from a demand side perspective, I think many of the elements are in place. So I do think that in the next 12 months, we are going to see an improvement over the volume growth that we've seen over the last 15 years. I think that's the first part which is there. I think the second element which is there is a set of supply side or industry actions which I think are going to drive some of this growth as we think about the next 6-12 months going forward.
Abheek, hi, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here. Before we started this chat in the break, we were talking about how inflation within the FMCG space has been higher than generalized inflation in the past decade odd. Yes. What are the trends that you're probably seeing now when it comes to inflation within the FMCG space? Is it still tracking higher, and the outlook on that?
Yeah. So, like Mangalam pointed out in the report, we found that if you take a long enough period, which is more than a decade, you see that FMCG staple prices on an average have doubled for the same SKU. So this is not accounting for the mix, etc. In the last 12 months, we have actually seen some softening of commodity prices. We've also seen increased action orientation by the FMCG players to actually grow categories and focus on category development. Therefore, if I take the next 12 to 24 month view, I think barring any massive spurts in commodity increase, we will see commodity inflation not being passed on and FMCG prices being more in the stable range than compared to in the past.
So volume growth is likely in the next 12 to 24 months?
Yes, I think if we do see this actions happening, which is around category development and price rationalization, I think we are going to see an uptick in volume growth in the next 12 months or so.
That's the near-term perspective. From a long-term standpoint, what are the suggestions that you would have for the industry to go ahead and spur their volume growth?
Yeah. So, I think this is a long-term phenomena which is there. I think the three big elements that I would say is actually rethinking about some of the metrics. So I'll give you an example. When one says about category penetration, the way some category penetration is defined is usage in the last 12 months. But for FMCG, is that the right metric, or should one think about usage and not penetration? So changing the vocabulary, I think, is number one. Number two is actually innovation in the middle. I think there is a lot of innovation which is happening at the top or premium end. But how does one think about innovation in the middle? I think some regional brands have done it, which I would say is offer 90%, 95% quality at a 60-65% price point. And the third is actually having diversity. Diversity of not only gender, but also in terms of thinking. So really cross-pollination of ideas, because if you look at sectors which have really grown well over the last 10, 15 years, it has actually had people from different sectors coming across. So I think third is the diversity of thought.
So your point is that FMCG leaders have not got people from other sectors into FMCG, and instead FMCG management has gone to other sectors, is what you're saying?
Yes, if one looks at it, FMCG has traditionally been an exporter of talent, net exporter of talent to multiple other sectors which have emerged.
Can you break up the trends between the rural and the urban going into next year?
Yeah, so great point. So just one thing to start off. Number one is, in this time period, we actually saw the similar kind of growth in both rural and urban, just to set as context. I think going forward, I do see there are some categories, and even if you look at last 15 years, you see categories like biscuits and noodles actually doing very well from a household consumption and volume growth. And I think part of that was driven by the actions of the companies who operate in that sector by focusing on rural distribution and access. So I think going forward, as rural distribution and access improves, we see that there is demand which is there in rural, right? So I think that's number one. Number two, I think there is sometimes a perception that rural is equal to only mass market or value. That's actually not true. For some of the premium categories, let's say even something like a chocolates or high-end biscuits, one finds that rural accounts for 25 to 40% of sales. So I think rural is not only the middle or the bottom, but it is also, the premium. I think that can drive rural growth as well. And third, I think is from a perspective of what happens from a farming sector perspective or agriculture sector perspective. Candidly, over a period of time, the dependence on monsoons is reducing. Therefore, the volatility in rural, I think, is coming lower.
Okay.
Are there some categories which have, which we can say have structurally become laggards when it comes to volume growth, and we should now start looking at categories of the future? Even the large listed players who are there in those categories, should they move beyond those categories?
So I personally think in India, it's never a question of or. It is and, right? So for example, if I take, it's not a question of washing powder or bar or liquid. I think all three. And all three actually have the potential. I think the question is, if one looks at washing powders, for example, washing liquids have, of course, grown the fastest, but that has been driven by a lot of innovation which has happened. Washing powder, one sees many of the regional players actually making a foray in the same. So I think, Mangalam, to answer your question, I see an opportunity at different price tiers. I think the right to win is probably different for different categories and different players.
Okay. So what is the range of volume growth that you're probably anticipating next year? Because, we do have a lot of variables, the elections, the Fed probably cutting rates at some point. Based on that, what is the volume growth that you're anticipating? And what is maybe the biggest risk to your estimates on the downside?
Yeah. Ekta, the first point I would say, averages hide a lot. So even the 3.4% that I was talking about actually has categories which have grown as high as 15% volume growth and as low as negative, right? But if I had to look at a general estimate, which is there, I would say one should expect more than 4.5% volume growth going forward. Right?
Okay.
But we will see the similar dispersion, and very naturally what ends up happening is categories which have low penetration will see greater volume growth. I think the important thing which I think is to keep in mind is we found for some highly penetrated categories, the category consumption in the same SEC-A or SEC-B household, that has actually declined over a 15-year period.
Wow.
Right? Now, as an example, as an SEC-A household starts eating out more, they will cook less, right? So some of this is just a transference. It should still lead to a net increase from an FMCG perspective, but you see different occasions happening.
All right, Abheek, thank you so much for joining in with this perspective. I believe that this is just one of the many conversations that we will have on this sector as we go, because this sector, as you said, keeps evolving and a lot of things keep happening. It's not limited to just one short conversation that we have.
No.
All right.
Thank you very much.
With that, we take a short break, come back on the other side. We have the commodity segment. Manisha joins in with Atulji Mundra, founder at Atul Mundra and Associates. Stay tuned.
CNBC-TV18, embarking on a quarter-century of excellence.
Hey, thank you for watching this on CNBC-TV18. Hope you liked it. For more such interesting news and updates, follow CNBC-TV18 on all the social media platforms.